I rented a quiet room to escape my debt collector, unaware the Mafia boss lived next door. I rented the quiet upstairs room because I was being hunted over a debt I could not deny. The wallpaper peeled near the ceiling, the pipes knocked at night, and the harbor wind slipped under the window frame. But the house sat on a still Bristol street where nobody asked questions. I told myself I could work, pay, and disappear there. I did not know the severe widower in the cottage next door was the most feared Mafia boss in New England. Russell Kane found me 6 days after I moved in. I was carrying canned soup and bargain coffee up the front walk when his sedan eased to the curb. He stepped out smiling that thin, polished smile I knew from hospital billing offices, temp jobs, and the funeral home parking lot. "Leah," he said almost warmly, "running does not reduce a balance. It only proves you understand how serious one is." I had not given Russell this address. I had not even told my cousins where I was sleeping. My room was supposed to be temporary, invisible, and cheap enough to survive in. Yet there he was, glancing at the porch and upstairs window like he already knew the map of my life. My first feeling was not fear. It was humiliation. Being found meant I was still somebody's unpaid account before I was fully myself again. Before I could answer, the neighboring cottage door opened. My next-door neighbor stepped out carrying a metal bird feeder full of seed. Victor Bellini wore a dark sweater, work boots, and the same unreadable face he had worn the 2 times we had crossed paths. He looked at Russell, then at me, then at the way my hand shook around the paper sack. "This man troubling you?" he asked. Russell turned, saw him, and lost his confidence in a single breath. "Mr. Bellini," he said, suddenly careful. Victor did not raise his voice. "This road stays peaceful when strangers remember when to leave it." Russell mumbled something about professional duty, got back into his car, and drove off without another word. Victor crossed the grass, lifted the oranges that had fallen from my torn bag, and placed them back inside as if nothing unusual had happened. If you enjoy stories where safety arrives wearing the face of danger, stay with me, because that was the moment I should have vanished again. Instead, I stood in the cold holding canned soup while the quiet man next door returned to filling a feeder, and I started wondering why my collector was more afraid of him than I was. At that point, I knew only a few things about Victor. He lived alone in the gray-shingled cottage beside the main house where I rented my room. Some mornings, a black sedan collected him before sunrise, driven by a man with church manners and broken knuckles, and every afternoon cardinals gathered in Victor's yard, as if they trusted him more than they trusted the weather. I was 31 and too tired to be mysterious. 3 years of caring for my mother through ovarian cancer had stripped away every dramatic instinct I once had. I sold jewelry, emptied savings, maxed out a personal loan, and worked odd jobs at night while managing medication schedules by day. When my mother died, people spoke about peace. Then the invoices arrived, and peace turned out to be expensive. The debt was real. That mattered to me. I had signed for the loan because I wanted 1 more year with my mother at home instead of in a facility we feared and could not truly afford. I would make that choice again. But a legitimate debt can still become a weapon when it lands in the hands of a man like Russell Kane, who knew shame often collects faster than money. Russell never threatened violence. He did something worse. He showed up where other people could see him. He said my full name too brightly in public places. He reminded supervisors that desperate employees sometimes make poor choices. He called before dawn and during dinner and while I stood in pharmacy lines. By the time I fled Providence for Bristol, his voice could tighten every muscle in my body. I found the room through a church bulletin. Furnished upstairs room, kitchen access, quiet tenant preferred. The woman who answered was Margaret Sloane, a widow in her 60s with silver hair, precise manners, and the kind of composure that made ordinary instructions sound kind. When I came to see the place, she looked at my worn coat, my folder of references, and the tiredness I could not hide. She asked only one thing. "Are you steady?" I said yes, because I needed it to be true. The room was plain but clean, with a narrow bed, a pine dresser, and a window overlooking the hedge between Margaret's house and Victor's cottage. The rent was modest enough to manage if I kept stacking work. On my first evening, Margaret carried up extra blankets and paused at the window. "That cottage belongs to my brother," she said. "He values quiet. Don't let the face fool you. He has better manners than most men." For several days, I barely saw him. I heard the gate latch, the scrape of a shovel at dawn, the low murmur of engines. Once I looked out and saw him clearing ice from an elderly neighbor's walkway before touching his own. Another time, he carried a waterlogged box of canned cat food from the curb to Arthur Pelham's porch before rain ruined it. He moved like a man used to being obeyed, but he spent that authority on ordinary mercies. Our first real conversation happened because my upstairs window would not stay locked. I was fighting with it one windy evening when Victor's voice rose from below. "Push the sash higher first." I told him I had tried. Within minutes, he was on a ladder tightening the warped latch with a short screwdriver. When he finished, he tested the lock twice and said, "Now it will hold." I offered to pay him. He looked faintly offended. "Not for 5 minutes' work." Then his eyes flicked to the cheap deadbolt I had installed on my bedroom door. "People rest better when they trust a lock," he said. "No shame in that." Most people either mocked fear or fed on it. Victor simply acknowledged it. That did something to me I should not have allowed. Life began settling into patterns that felt dangerously close to comfort. I worked temp administrative shifts in Warren and weekend reception at a marina when I could get hours. Margaret liked breakfast early and old radio shows in the kitchen. Victor liked silence until 9 and black coffee after. At first, we only nodded across the hedge. Then one morning, he asked whether my right knee was troubling me because he had seen me favor it on the back steps. I stared at him. I had not mentioned the knee. He pointed to the railing. "You grip there before the last 2 stairs." The next day, a wooden stool appeared near the garden path so I could sit while waiting for rides. Margaret claimed no knowledge of it. I did not believe her. What unsettled me most was that Victor never used kindness to create a debt of its own. If I thanked him, he changed the subject. If I refused help, he accepted that too. A week after Russell first found me, I saw Victor helping Arthur Pelham into his car outside the pharmacy. Arthur was 81, recovering from hip surgery, and complaining loudly enough to cover 3 parking lots. Victor adjusted his seatbelt, tucked the prescription bag at his feet, and reminded him twice to use the ice packs. Arthur rolled his eyes and obeyed. Later, the bakery cashier told me, in that easy, small-town way, that Victor had looked after half the widows on our street. Then she used his surname, Bellini. Even I had heard it before. Not details, just the broad, uneasy outline. Shipping, Providence, construction bids. Men who did not like refusal. News articles that never quite said organized crime but walked around the idea. I went home with rye bread and a pounding heart. That night, when I looked through the hedge, Victor was standing under the porch light repairing a red feeder while cardinals waited for him on the railing. Russell came back the next week. I was walking from the bus stop with timesheets under my arm when his car slowed beside me. He did not get out. "You picked an interesting neighborhood," he said through the open window. "Careful which protectors you trust. Some men prefer women grateful and cornered." Before I answered, a black sedan stopped in the road behind him. Victor's driver stepped out, and Russell drove away so fast his tires spat gravel. Victor was waiting at the hedge when I reached the yard. "You can leave here if my name frightens you," he said. I would rather hear it now than later. I asked him the question I was too tired to decorate. "Is your name the one people whisper about?" He held my gaze for a long moment. "Usually." I expected denial or anger. Instead, he handed me the truth, stripped down to its frame. "You know enough to decide," he said. There was something unbearable about that honesty. He was not trying to charm me into staying. He was making room for my fear. I thought about finding another room, another bus route, another set of locks. Then I thought about Russell smiling outside the gate, and about Victor clearing old women's steps before dawn. "I'm staying," I said. He nodded once, as if I had signed something formal, and from that day forward the space between us changed. Victor did not become warmer so much as less hidden. He spoke to me on the porch instead of across the hedge. He asked whether the temp office had found permanent staff, and whether the bus left me waiting too long in the cold. Once he showed me which board on Margaret's back step liked to catch my heel. When I laughed at something Arthur said over chess, Victor looked briefly startled by the sound, as if he had forgotten laughter could belong in his yard. The first time I entered his cottage, a storm had knocked out Margaret's kitchen power. Victor appeared at the side door holding a lantern and said, "My generator runs the back rooms. Bring your groceries before the freezer thaws." Inside, the cottage smelled of cedar, coffee, and old books. Everything was neat without feeling unlived in. Over the mantel stood one photograph of a dark-haired woman smiling into salt wind. "My wife," Victor said when he saw me looking. He did not need to add anything else. There was a softness around the photograph that had the shape of long grief. He set my bag on the counter, handed me a towel, and after a moment said, "Elena fed the cardinals. After she died, they kept coming back. It felt rude to stop." That sentence moved me more than any practiced romance could have. It revealed loyalty without asking admiration for it. The storm deepened, and Margaret stayed across town with relatives who still had power. Victor made tomato soup from jars he had canned himself, and behaved as if feeding me during a blackout required no comment. We ate at a plain wood table while rain hammered the windows. He asked about my mother in the steady way he asked everything, never circling closer than I allowed. When I told him I had kept her at home until the end, he simply said, "That matters." Most people had opinions about that choice. Some praised me until praise curdled into guilt. Some quietly suggested I had been reckless. Victor was the first person to name the cost without making me defend it. I told him about the loan then, not the exact balance, but enough. He did not offer me money. He did not call me proud when I would have refused it anyway. He only asked, "Is the collector acting within the law?" When I said, "More or less," his mouth tightened. The next morning he walked me back through wet grass after the storm passed. At the porch steps he glanced up toward my room. "You don't sleep much," he said. "Neither do you," I answered. For the first time the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it changed the weather between us. I went upstairs aware that loneliness becomes dangerous when it finally meets recognition. Weeks passed. The cardinals learned my habits and began appearing when I came outside with tea. Arthur started calling me Victor's audience because, according to him, Victor had spent years giving his best speeches only to dogs, priests, and mechanics. Victor kept my preferred tea in his kitchen after I mentioned I could not drink coffee after 4. I learned he hated loose change in his pockets and that he read shipping reports with the same attention he gave bird feeders and medication instructions. Once, after Arthur's physical therapy ran late, Victor and I drove him home from Newport because the transport service failed to show. Arthur fell asleep in the back seat complaining about the Red Sox. On the ride back, Victor asked whether I missed Providence. I told him I missed the version of myself who had lived there before illness and bills remade everything. His hands stayed steady on the wheel. "That woman isn't gone," he said. "She's buried under work." Another evening I found an injured sparrow under Margaret's hydrangeas. I carried it to Victor because I had seen how gently he handled even frightened animals. He called a wildlife rehabilitator, and we drove there together with the heater low and the little box on my lap. On the way back, you told me Elena used to rescue things that could not defend themselves. "Grief is domestic," he said. It hides in drawers. I answered before thinking, so does love. The silence after that did not embarrass either of us. By then, the whole town seemed to know some version of us before I did. The woman at the fish counter stopped asking if I needed help carrying my bags. Arthur's daughter sent over soup labeled for 2. Even the priest, after Sunday Mass, looked at us too carefully. I should have been alarmed. Instead, I felt the bewildering happiness of being witnessed in something gentle after so much strain. That may be why the next part cut so deeply. I had started to hope. The first crack came through Russell. He cornered me outside the physical therapy office and said I should stop taking the late Thursday bus because my knee stiffened by the second stop. He said it while examining his cufflinks, like a banker discussing weather. I had told only 3 people about the knee: Margaret, Arthur, Victor. Fear did not strike all at once. It arrived in cold layers. By the time Russell drove away, my whole body felt borrowed. That evening, Margaret found me at the sink with my hands braced against the counter. She listened while I repeated Russell's words, then sighed as if debating how much to say. Victor likes to know the shape of a problem before he acts, she said carefully. He may have asked someone to find out who owns your debt now. Men in his world are thorough. I turned toward her. Without telling me? She spread her hands. Concern can look like interference from the wrong angle. I wanted to dismiss her warning, but it slid too neatly into my oldest fear. Love, if that was what this had become, awakened the terror illness and debt had sharpened in me, losing control of my life while someone insisted it was for my own good. Victor had never humiliated me, never pushed, never acted entitled to gratitude. That history argued for him. Yet Russell's knowledge had not come from nowhere, and Victor was the only person on that list with the reach to turn information into pressure. I did not confront him that night. I watched from my window as he refilled the feeder in darkness, one hand shielding the seed from the wind. The next morning he brought over a jar of plum preserves and noticed at once that something was wrong. "You're quiet," he said. "Tired," I answered. He studied me, then let it pass. His restraint, which had once felt like shelter, began to feel like a locked drawer I could not open. Around the same time, Victor started spending more nights in Bristol than in Providence. The calls he took on the porch grew shorter and sharper. Twice I heard him tell someone, "Not after winter." Margaret noticed too. Her smile tightened whenever Arthur joked that Victor had become a country gentleman. One evening he invited me to walk to the harbor overlook after supper. The tourists were gone. Gulls circled over dark water. Without preamble, he said, "A life can calcify around duty if you let it." I waited. He watched the harbor and continued, "I've been considering changes. Less travel, less direct involvement in certain matters." He said it like business, but there was vulnerability under the formality. "Because you're tired?" I asked. "Because I remembered there may be another way to spend what remains of my life," he said. Nothing in that sentence was an explicit confession, yet every word touched me. Later, I would think of that moment as the last clear place where truth might have won. The second crack came disguised as kindness. Margaret stopped me in the hallway and said she did not want me blindsided by gossip. Then she mentioned, with soft reluctance, that Victor had indeed spoken to an attorney about my account. "Probably to protect you from illegal collection tactics," she added. "But men like my brother can forget that investigations feel invasive to ordinary people." She was careful not to tell a direct lie. That made it worse. My mind supplied the darkest version on its own. When I asked Victor about it, he was trimming dead branches from the rosebush Elena had planted years earlier. He went still for one beat too long. "I looked into whether Kane was acting outside the law," he said. "You shouldn't have," I answered. His jaw tightened. "If a man is using fear as leverage, I prefer to know." On another day, that answer might have comforted me. Instead, I heard only the part where he had acted first and told me later. "Did you tell him to back off?" I asked. "No," he said immediately, and I believe now that the word was true. But I also saw something withheld in his face. He was protecting sources, or strategy, or pride. At the time I thought, if he can move men and money across states, how hard would it be to decide exactly how frightened I should remain? I said I needed air and walked toward the harbor road alone. He did not follow. That hurt more than pursuit would have. Russell chose his next move well. He met me outside the bank after I deposited 2 small paychecks and waved a printed statement as if he were doing me a favor. "Interesting how fast Bellini people learn the details of a file," he said. "Some men like to keep a woman grateful. A little pressure makes protection feel romantic." I told him he was disgusting. He shrugged. "Maybe. But ask yourself why the pursuit got worse only after you moved next door to a man who likes control." That night I sat in my room staring at the payment schedule inside my dresser drawer. Every amount mattered. Every hour I worked mattered. If Victor had quietly arranged even a fraction of Russell's pressure so I would lean harder on him, it would not matter how gently he had done everything else. The cage would still be a cage. And what frightened me most was that part of me still wanted his voice at the door. Meanwhile, I did not know Margaret was telling Victor a different story. Much later I learned she mentioned hearing me ask how quickly a wealthy man could make a debt disappear. What I had actually asked, during a conversation about a foreclosed house on the next block, was how someone decided which losses to rescue and which to let stand. She bent the memory just far enough to make him wonder whether I was already imagining freedom purchased by his money. He grew gentler with me after that, which only deepened my suspicion. He carried kindling to Margaret's porch before a freeze, left a newspaper clipping about debt collection violations on the kitchen table, and asked whether I needed a ride when buses were delayed. Each gesture could be read as care. Each could also be read, by a frightened woman already primed by shame, as a hand closing softly around the edges of her life. Then came the church bazaar. The afternoon doubt tipped into panic. Margaret ran the raffle table. Arthur loudly lost a bean-counting contest, and Victor stood near the bake sale with a man in an expensive coat I did not know. I passed behind them carrying coffee-urn supplies and heard only the end of the exchange. The stranger said, "We can buy the paper or pressure the paper, whichever you prefer." Victor answered, "No purchase, no public mess. Keep it legal, but keep it close." He had not seen me. I walked out the side door into the cold so fast I nearly dropped the tray. Keep it legal, but keep it close. The words locked into place beside Russell's smile, Margaret's warnings, and the bank statement. I did not wait for context or ask who the man meant. Every old instinct screamed that I had mistaken patience for strategy. By the time Victor found me near the parish fence, I had already built the worst story and believed it. "What are you doing to me?" I asked. He looked genuinely taken aback. "Leah." "No, don't use that voice while you decide how frightened I should be." Hurt passed across his face and held very still. "If this is about Cain, I am trying to stop a man who believes embarrassment is leverage." I laughed once, sharp and joyless. "By deciding how much pressure to leave in place? By discussing whether to buy my debt like I'm livestock?" "I have not bought your debt," he said. "That isn't the question." My hands were shaking so hard I buried them in my coat pockets. "Did you let this continue because you knew I would stay close to the man who could protect me from it?" He stared at me as if I had spoken in another language. In that silence, I searched for outrage, for immediate denial, for anything simple. What I saw instead was a man weighing words. I mistook caution for confirmation. Before he could answer, Margaret hurried through the side door saying the raffle cash box was short. The interruption lasted seconds, but it broke something fragile beyond repair. Victor looked from her to me with sudden weariness. "We should talk when you're calmer," he said. It was the worst sentence he could have chosen. Calmer made my fear sound like a temperament problem, and the facts sound like his to distribute. I walked away before I said something I could not take back. For 2 nights, I did not go near the hedge. I left early, came back late, and pretended my room still belonged to me. Victor did not corner me or send messages through Arthur. That should have reassured me. Instead, it let the poison settle. If he had been innocent, I told myself, he would have climbed the stairs and said so plainly. But Victor Bellini was a man used to command, used to information, used to deciding what was necessary. On the 3rd evening, Russell called from a blocked number. "Interesting timing," he said. "Bellini's legal people ask questions, and suddenly everyone wants to know where this account lands. That sort of attention can make terms harsher before they get softer. Depends what story your protector tells." I hung up, but not before he added, "Men like that don't give women freedom. They give them better cages." It was a manipulative line from a manipulative man. The problem was that I was no longer sure he was entirely wrong. Tell me honestly in the comments, if you loved someone who made you feel safe for the first time in years, but you started believing he had quietly managed your fear to keep you near him, would you stay for one more explanation? Or would you leave before gratitude turned into another kind of debt? I packed before dawn. Not everything. Just clothes, papers, my mother's photograph, and the tin box where I kept payment records proving I was still moving forward on my own. Every drawer I opened made the room look less like refuge and more like evidence of another mistake. Outside, the first gray light bled into the yard. Victor's kitchen lamp was on. He was awake. That was when I understood I had been waiting all along for him to cross the grass and make the truth impossible to miss. He did not come. I carried my first bag downstairs and found Margaret in the kitchen wearing her robe, both hands around a mug she was not drinking from. Her face lost color when she saw the suitcase. "You're leaving?" I said yes. She asked whether this was necessary. The question angered me more than if she had argued. "If a man scares another man for me, that's one thing," I said. "If he decides how much fear I need so I'll stay grateful, that's another." "He cares for you," she whispered. "That may be true," I said. "It isn't enough." I walked past her before she could say more because some part of me still feared she would say the one thing that might make me stay. Outside, frost silvered the hedge tops and the feeders hung motionless in the dawn. I loaded my bags into a co-worker's hatchback from Warren. Nothing about heartbreak looks dramatic at 7 in the morning. Victor appeared only after I had set the last box by the curb. He came from the side path in a dark coat, no driver, no visible anger. He looked as if he had not slept. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I wanted him to say I had misunderstood everything. I wanted him to say he had never allowed a single ounce of pressure to remain on my life for the sake of control. He said none of those things. Instead, he asked very quietly, "Have you found somewhere safe?" The question almost broke me because it was so like him, so practical and so careful. "Safe enough," I answered. His eyes moved to the box holding my mother's photograph. "If Kane follows you again," he said, "call Arthur's number. He knows how to reach me." I stared at him. Even then, he spoke like a guardian issuing instructions. "That's all?" I asked. "That's what you have to say?" His throat worked once. "Anything more from me may feel like pressure." There it was, the logic that would haunt me for months. He thought silence was moral. I thought silence was guilt. Between those two convictions stood everything we could not save. "You should have trusted me with the truth when it first involved me," I said. He absorbed that as if he had no defense. Maybe he believed he deserved the accusation. Maybe he thought giving me a clean exit was love. I left before I could ask. The new apartment was in East Providence above a laundromat that smelled of bleach and hot metal. It was smaller, noisier, and costlier than Margaret's room, but no one there knew my habits. I added overtime wherever I could and paid the debt in hard, humiliating slices. Russell's calls changed after I moved. He sounded less confident, more procedural. 2 months later, his company reassigned my file after an investigation into collection practices I never officially filed somehow found him. Winter turned toward spring. I kept working. Some mornings I woke convinced I had escaped a subtle form of captivity. Other mornings I woke missing the exact weight of silence in Victor's kitchen and the click of cardinals landing on a feeder tray. I never called Arthur's number. Pride can masquerade as healing for a long time if nobody challenges it. In April, I saw Arthur outside a clinic in Providence, glaring at a parking meter that had eaten his coins. When he recognized me, he said, "Well, there's the woman who taught my friend the cost of acting noble." We sat on a bench because Arthur did not respect delicate avoidance. He told me Victor had mostly stayed in Bristol all winter. "Talks even less than before," Arthur added. Then, after enough grumbling, he said the words that cracked my certainty. Victor had never bought my debt. Arthur told me Victor's attorney had been documenting Russell's methods, not trying to own my obligation. "The fool wouldn't explain himself because he was raised by men who think explaining anything sounds like begging," Arthur said. Those words opened no neat path to forgiveness. Knowing Victor had not bought the paper did not erase the fact that he had investigated my problem without permission. But certainty began to fray. I replayed the church bazaar conversation and heard, for the first time, another possible meaning. I tried not to think too hard about Margaret until June, when I went back to Bristol for a parish rummage sale and found her alone in the church garden clipping dead roses. She looked older, as if winter had worked on her from the inside. After a few practical sentences about Arthur and the weather, she set the shears down and said, "I owe you a truth, though not a complete one." My stomach tightened before she spoke again. Margaret confessed in fragments. She had favored my application the moment she learned I had cared for my mother at home. She believed my steadiness might draw Victor back toward ordinary life. Then she admitted she had told Russell where to find me after he began calling the house, because she wanted Victor to step in and scare him off. "I thought it would end there," she said. "I thought I was helping two lonely people toward each other." The garden seemed to tilt. "You chose me," I said. She nodded. "And when you realized he loved me?" Her hand covered her mouth. "I became afraid," she said. "My brother has been the center beam of this family for years. If he changed his life around you, I did not know who I would be." Her honesty was so ugly it almost felt clean. "So you fed both of us half-truths," I said. Tears filled her eyes, but I felt colder than pity. I asked the only question that mattered. "Did he know?" "No," she said at once. I believed her. Whatever Victor's faults, that particular cruelty was not his. We stood among the roses while someone inside tested the church organ for evening practice. Finally, Margaret whispered, "He thinks you left because life beside him could only ever be temporary." I looked at her and said the cleanest truth I had spoken in months. No, I left because I believed he was deciding my freedom for me. Margaret began to cry then, quiet, helpless tears that did not move me as much as they once would have. I did not comfort her. Compassion has limits when it discovers itself arranged like furniture inside another person's fear. She asked whether I would speak to Victor. I said I did not know. That was the truth. Love had not vanished, but trust, once cracked along the grain of shame and secrecy, does not leap back together because motives turn tragic instead of cruel. All summer I carried that knowledge like a stone warmed in my pocket. Some days I wanted to drive straight to Bristol and demand why Victor had chosen noble silence over one honest fight for us. Some days I wanted never to see any of them again. My debt kept shrinking. My hours stayed long. The laundromat rattled through midnight. And still, in every grocery aisle where I reached for the tea he used to keep in his pantry, grief returned with fresh edges. In late August, Arthur called to say he had fallen. Nothing dramatic, but the clinic kept him overnight and he refused to eat hospital pudding unless I visited with decent cookies. I almost declined. Then I heard my mother's voice in memory telling me that avoiding pain only teaches pain where to wait. So I went. After 3 cookies and several insults aimed at the television news, Arthur finally said, "He'll be at the cottage this evening. If you mean to finish this story, old people would appreciate the closure." I drove to Bristol at dusk with no speech prepared. The hedge was fuller than I remembered. The feeders swung lightly over the yard, and cardinals flashed red through the branches like little warnings. Victor was on the back step repairing a gate latch. When he looked up and saw me, he did not move at first. He set down the screwdriver slowly, as if sudden motion might scatter the whole moment. "I spoke to Margaret," I said. He closed his eyes briefly, not in surprise, but in recognition of an old blow finally landing. "Then you know more than you did." I walked closer until the hedge no longer divided us. "I know she chose me. I know she gave Russell enough to find me. I know she bent truths until they cut." He listened without interrupting. "And I know you did not buy my debt." At that, something in his face loosened and tightened at the same time. "I should have told you everything the first time I made one inquiry," he said. "Yes. I thought if I explained too late, it would sound like defense instead of truth." "It did," I answered. He accepted that without argument. Evening wind moved through the yard carrying cut grass and salt water. Then I asked the question I should have asked before leaving. "When I packed, why didn't you stop me?" He looked at the feeder pole instead of me. "Because Margaret had convinced me you wanted a life untouched by what I am, and I believed pressing you to stay would prove every fear you had. I thought the only decent thing left was to let you walk away clean." I laughed once without humor. There was nothing clean about it. Pain crossed his face so openly that I almost reached for him and did not. Then he did something Victor rarely did. He kept speaking before silence could rescue him. He told me about the attorney, about documenting Russell's harassment without touching the debt itself, because he knew I would never accept having it erased. He admitted he should have understood that any investigation done without my consent could feel like trespass to someone already cornered by obligation. "I was precise about the law," he said. "I was careless with your dignity." There was no better apology available than that. I told him I had been careless too. I had let Russell's cruelty and Margaret's nudges interpret Victor for me, because part of me already believed love always came with hidden terms. My mother's illness had taught me to survive by handling things alone. When something felt wrong, leaving became easier than asking to be disappointed out loud. He nodded like a man recognizing a language he spoke badly but understood. For a moment I thought we might still salvage something. Then the full weight of time between us settled in. Too much had happened in silence. Too many choices had been made for each other and defended as love. I looked at the cottage, the hedge, the upstairs window where I had once watched him fill Elena's feeders, and believed I might finally have found a life that was mine. "I still love you," I said. "That isn't enough either." He stepped forward once and stopped there, respecting the line I had not asked him to cross. "No," he said softly, "it isn't." If he had begged or argued, the old anger might have returned and made things easier. Instead, he offered me the difficult mercy of agreement. We stood in the fading light while the cardinals settled for evening, and Arthur's porch radio carried a hymn I could not name. Some endings break because people stop loving each other. Ours broke while love was still alive. I left before full dark. At the car, Victor said my name once, and when I turned, he did not ask me to stay. He only said, "I am glad you came back for the truth." I answered, "I wish truth had come sooner." Then I drove away carrying both the wound and the relief of finally understanding it. By the first cold week of October, I made my last payment. I sat above the laundromat with the receipt in my lap and cried harder than I had cried when the balance was highest. Freedom arrived not with triumph, but with exhaustion. My debt was gone. My mother was still gone. Victor was still in Bristol behind a hedge neither of us had crossed in time. The next day I bought a bird feeder and hung it outside my kitchen window. If this story stayed with you, press like and subscribe, because some love stories do not end in weddings or funerals. They end in understanding, in the hard knowledge of what dignity costs and what silence destroys. And if you have ever mistaken restraint for truth or fear for proof, stay close. The next story may hit even nearer to home. Some mornings, when the laundromat below me is quiet and the first red bird lands at my window, I imagine the Bristol yard at 4 o'clock, seed falling from Victor's hand, his head bowed into the wind. I do not know whether he still buys my tea. I only know some people remain in your life by reshaping your solitude. Victor Bellini was that for me, and I was, I think, that for him.